Hey guys, if you've seen any of my recent video reviews or even some of my Instagram posts, you've seen me do a lot of shooting while moving, or basically incorporating movement into my shooting repertoire. And the reason I've been doing this is because it really helps me expand as a shooter and get better. Shooting on the move is probably one of the most difficult things to do for a shooter and most difficult skills to learn. But there are some key components, key aspects to it. It really makes the whole thing a lot more approachable. You have to keep in mind, like anything, it takes a lot of dedicated practice to truly master. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do in order to master shooting on the move is get used to walking heel to toe, what some guys call the Groucho walk. And I was fortunate enough to be taught by Lieutenant Colonel Mike Hartman of the IDF, so I've got this technique pretty down pat. Even still, it's very, very difficult, especially if you're wearing the wrong type of footwear. Going heel to toe, and keeping yourself level is very difficult with combat boots on. It's a lot easier with running shoes. That said, one of the key aspects of doing so, of mastering this technique, is to imagine yourself carrying a platter full of glassware stacked 3 or 4 levels high. You want to try to find a walking technique, if you will, that keeps your upper torso as level and stable as humanly possible. This is because accuracy, at least in terms of firearms, is all about consistency. Doing things the exact same way every single time. The problem with moving while shooting is that you're introducing a variable you have almost no control over, which is the ground itself. Now, to maximize how difficult this can be, I'm actually out here in the woods walking across roots and dirt and rocks and all kinds of fun stuff, and I'll be demonstrating some techniques and how I personally have learned to shoot better with this technique. Now, the rifle I'll be using initially is my personal X95. It's a Tavor, obviously, and it's an excellent choice if you think you're going to need to stay mobile during a shootout, which you should always do if there's no hard cover available. It's very easy to hit a stationary target at close range. If the target's shooting back at you, don't make their life any easier. Try to integrate as much movement as possible, preferably perpendicular movement, not parallel. You don't want to ever walk straight at your target for the sole fact that you're just a gradually enlarging target for them. I mean, from their perspective, you're getting bigger and bigger and bigger the closer you get. If you're moving perpendicular, they have to compensate for the fact that, oh, I need to aim ahead of him, or maybe I don't because he's so close, the rounds are going fast enough. You're just making his life a lot harder, which, since he's trying to kill you, is in your best interest. So, without further ado, let's try this one out first. We'll start off with a bullpup carbine, the X95. We've got some standard 55 grain full metal jackets, and we're shooting at this shootsteel.com close range target, because we're going to be shooting and engaging this target at about 20 yards, which is awfully close. And you should never shoot at steel targets that close if they're not designed to be shot that close, because you run the risk of severe ricochets. All right, let's give it a spin and see how I do. Now, you may have noticed on that first target, which was only about 15, 20 yards away, I proceeded to charge it basically heel to toe. Now, that was to demonstrate the effectiveness of this technique without integrating the perpendicular movement. Now, I actually integrated it at a more distant target, which is about 45 to 50 yards away, which is a close approximation of a human torso. Now, I didn't hit it every single time, and unless you're very, very, very good or very practiced, you're not going to. But if you were to try this while stomping around like you were, just woke up first thing in the morning and try to shoot, the amount of muzzle drift you would have, you would hit nothing. Now, I'm sure you put on a good show trying, but you really wouldn't hit very much. So this is actually one of the most difficult things about running a gun while moving is the recoil keeps taking you off target. And at the same time, you're fighting the fact that your feet are landing unevenly, and which is moving you in another direction. So you're kind of trying to compensate for recoil. At the same time, you're trying to compensate for the fact that your feet are bringing your target down, or your crosshair down, while the recoil is bringing you up. In a perfect world, you'd be able to fire the round the second your foot landed, compensating for the recoil, bringing you back up on target. But that's Hollywood action movie stuff. That's not real at all. So that's actually brings me to one of the things I like the most about running a pistol caliber carbine versus even a bullpup is the negligible recoil. So for this portion, let me show you what I'm talking about with my personally owned SBR SIG MPX, topped off with an Osprey 45 suppressor, so I can get rid of these earplugs for a second, and run it here at close range, and we'll see how that does. Now you'll notice that when I was moving and shooting just then, I started out going right at the target, and as soon as I could find some kind of cover or concealment between me and the target, that's when I started my lateral movement. So I was able to keep the target in my sights and then introduce that extra plane of movement. Now what's interesting is, and if you've been paying attention, you've noticed, I'm not using any sort of magnified sight because it's extraordinarily difficult to move, shoot, aim properly and get that proper sight picture if you have a magnified optic. With a hollow sight or that SIG Romeo 3 reflex sight I had on the X95, as long as you can see through this window, then the sight picture is good enough. On a magnified optic, there is a sweet spot where your eye has to be in, they call it eye relief, that if your eye's not within that little region, then you get a raccooning effect, or you just simply can't see down the scope tube at all. So if you take that and then introduce the fact that your head will be bobbing up and down as you walk, you're never going to obtain a proper sight picture. That's why I go for these rapid target acquisition sights, these reflex sights like this EOTech XPS3. It's really, really nice. Thermal drift aside, I'm shooting at 15 to 20 yards. Not that concerned with it. All right, so that was a lot faster, I'm sure you noticed, because 9mm out of a piston-driven action produces like no recoil, and those are 147 grade subsonics, that's why they sounded so quiet. And I probably had an 85 or an 88, 90% hit rate right there, given I'm only 20 yards away, but I'm still moving. And if that person were shooting back at me, I don't think he'd argue that I didn't make every single shot. All right, so let's get to the last most difficult aspect or most difficult weapon to do movement and shooting with, which is a handgun. Despite what Hollywood tells you, you cannot simply run straight at your target, pistol cocked just slightly, maybe 45 degrees, and screaming with anger and make that shot at 200 yards, nor can you Tom Hanks a Panzer rolling at you across the bridge with one shot. Or was that a Mustang? Either way. So we're gonna take a closer look at what it takes to shoot a handgun on the move, and there's a couple of key aspects and fundamentals really boil down, and they'll either save or screw you, depending on how well you grasp those fundamentals and how well practiced you are. Because under stress, we tend to fall back on our training, on muscle memory. So I'm sure you've heard a million trainers say it a billion times, keep your eye on the front sight. You have to do this. It's really, really difficult to do this with a carbine, and I don't. That's exactly why I use an EOTech sight right here, is because it only comes into focus when I'm looking at the target. In a fight or flight situation, your brain's gonna wanna tell you, holy cow, look at that target, look at that guy trying to hurt you. Don't look at your damn gun, look at that guy, what is he doing? Look at his hands, you know what I mean? So this is a perfect sight for that, because the crosshair, the reticle, only comes into focus when you look beyond it and focus on your target. It's pretty cool. With a handgun, it's a lot more difficult. You have to pretty much force yourself to keep your focus on the front sight. So for this next part, we'll be using the loved and loathed Beretta M9 to see how well I do trying to hit this guy at about 15, 20 yards. So you just saw me advance upon that target with this Model 92, this M9, and I was actually surprisingly effective with it. Now, yes, my technique was pretty good, but it also has to do with a lot of practice behind this gun and the fact that this is a Wonder 9, an all steel frame 9mm handgun, so it has very, very little recoil to it. I was running standard 115 grain full metal jackets, and a couple of things come into play when you're running a handgun while moving on a target, right? So yes, focus on the front sight, very important. But at the same time, trigger control and grip become infinitely more important now the shooter has to contend with so many additional variables. You don't want to make your life any harder by throwing those rounds off target, because it's really frustrating to have that perfect sight picture, think you nailed that target, and then you realize you jerked the trigger and pulled the gun either right or left off target. Now, it's frustrating as hell in training, and it's deadly in a life or death situation. So what's the takeaway for all of this? Well, like anything, it requires a great deal of practice, but also it requires a steady hand. And that's not something you can necessarily train, but it is something you can foster, and there is a difference. With this, you can get accustomed to running a gun and being a little more smooth by Groucho walking in your home with, a very, very full cup of water. Your wife will probably hate you for it, but she might thank you one day for saving her life. Now, obviously, in a home defense scenario, you shouldn't be moving room to room, clearing rooms like you're the action hero in the latest Tom Clancy novel, but it's a very good skill to have for concealed carry guys, preppers, competitive guys, because you don't always get that perfect shot where you can stop, line your sights up, carefully squeeze the trigger. Sometimes you need to get your ass out of dodge while throwing rounds down range. And if you can do that more accurately than the guy who's shooting at you, it just might save the day. Thanks, guys. If you want to see more videos like this or more reviews, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more Burst Reviews.